Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm excited to welcome Richard Simpson and Marketa Simova to the show. Welcome both.
Hi, thank you for the invite.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Looking forward to today.
Really excited to have you both on. We're going to be talking all things well-being, well-being of the athlete, well-being of the coach, which isn't often spoken about, and well-being on an individual level, on an interpersonal, on a group level. So we're really going to unpack well-being in sport today. But let's start where we always start. Let's get to know our guests. So, Marketa, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, I'm a PhD researcher at Sheffield Hallam University, and my research predominantly focuses on coaches' well-being, how it works, how it looks, and basically thanks to my presentation in June, we met with Richard and we realized that there are a couple of things and pet peeves we both have when it comes to well-being research. One of them being its inaccessibility to the population we actually talk about. And yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to do, just trying to look at well-being slightly differently with coaches in mind and working on it with them.
Well, Marketa, it's such an important area in sports psychology, isn't it? Well-being in sport. And as you said there, you focus mainly on the well-being of the coach, which is something I'm excited to unpack and get to learn more about. And you mentioned their presentation you did back in June. And actually, this has come up a few times on the Sports Psych show. There was a big European sports psychology conference in Padova in Italy in June, and I think that's the one you were alluding to, and that's where you teamed up with Richard to talk all things well-being with the audience. So, and Marketa, just before we move on to Richard, I mean, where does your interest in well-being stem from, and has it anything to do with your own sporting background?
Yes, so I did sport to a fairly high level for many years back in the Czech Republic, and because I was in aesthetic background, mental health and well-being was quite significant thing there, even though no one spoke about it. And so then when I went to do my master's in Loughborough, I basically found out that all the modules that I ever been interested in were around mental health and well-being. And so it kind of protruded now to my PhD.
And sorry, what was your sport? Did you compete into a good level?
So I did gymnastic aerobics and I did ballroom dancing.
Oh wow, how cool! And was the psychological side a strength of yours? Would you say when you reflect back?
You know what? I think it was purely because thanks to my parents, I always kept a very healthy look onto the elite sport. They never let me actually not have unhealthy look at sports. So I think thanks to that, yes.
Really interesting stuff. And I'm sure we'll refer to your experiences within gymnastics. I mean, very relevant sport when it comes to considering the well-being of participants. And over to you, Richard Simpson. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, goodness me. Where do we start? So I guess we'll start at the beginning of my academic journey. So I've always been involved in sport in quite a few ways, whether I've dipped my toe in quite a few waters, not necessarily successfully, but I've been the jack of all trades in terms of I've done a little bit of coaching. I've done a little bit of trying to perform, I suppose, in some ways, playing badminton and racket sports, coaching in football and racket sports, and then also tried officiating as a referee, very short-lived. I think that what that really inspired me to do an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise sciences at Leeds Trinity University. I then went on to do the masters in sport and exercise psychology at Leeds Becket University, where I kind of maintained relationships and kind of really became interested in exploring psychological well-being in sport organizations, which is now the title of my PhD. Alongside my PhD, I'm an associate lecturer at Leeds Becket University and also the Open University, as well as a kind of a research assistant as well, working on projects with clients from different international federations across the world of sport on well-being and also social justice issues as well.
Now, let's begin at the beginning. My understanding is it's actually quite tricky to pinpoint a definition of well-being. That there's probably multiple definitions out there. This could be a question to either of you. Am I right in saying that? And if so, or if not, what well-being definition have both of you? Would both of you point to as the most accurate?
Firstly, thank you for asking that question, because I think we need to address it head on. It's often quite a question that, you know, researchers and practitioners, you'd ask them, like, what is well-being? And I think this is the beauty of some of the work that Marketa and I are doing together, is celebrating that, like, there is differences in how people view well-being, and that is okay. I mean, I'll pass on to you to share your thoughts before I share mine.
Thank you. You know what? I think you're right. There is plenty of definitions of well-being. And what my research showed me is that none of them is necessarily right. And, you know, we are, in theory, talking about this version of of this goodness in life, the overall happiness, if you come from the positivist psychology. Well, who are we to say, for example, in my case, to coaches, what is well-being to them? It might as well be just surviving in high performance sport, and it's no place for me to judge that that's well-being to them. And, you know, if you say well-being is happiness, well, from the conversations I had and, you know, all the podcasts you listen to, you realize coaches aren't that happy every single time. And are we actually creating even more pressure onto them by saying, oh, you should be happy every single day in order to achieve well-being? Isn't it actually counterproductive? And shouldn't we just swap and rethink? And I think that's where with Richard we agreed that we're just fed up of talking about this theoretical philosophical goodness, and we need to move kind of away from it because it doesn't bring anything to practice.
It's fascinating because it's something that we've spoken on about, is the pursuit of an all-encompassing holy grail definition, which has almost been eluding kind of sports psychology researchers. And I think one thing that I'm certainly pursuing in some ways is the fact that we shouldn't be looking necessarily to have the holy grail definition of well-being. We shouldn't be looking for that. And the reasons for that is that we've got so many different dimensions of well-being that we need to consider. You heard a few dimensions that we were talking about there, that, you know, we typically understand well-being from two dimensions. So we've got hedonia, so simplified, how are you feeling, is how I'd simplify that. There's obviously different nuances with hedonia. It's usually how are you feeling. And eudaimonia usually encompasses how well we are doing, essentially. And those are the two main dimensions, by no means the only dimensions of well-being out there, but two of the key dimensions out there that are used quite heavily in understanding what is a good life or a functioning life in sport. Now, I take a kind of slightly different approach in terms of, whilst I don't want to look to define well-being, I really try and understand the temporal underpinnings of how well-being changes over time, and what the meanings of well-being to coaches, to athletes, to sport and exercise psychology practitioners will differ and change over time. So for me, I've kind of taken the approach that we don't necessarily look to define well-being, but we look to understand it in different times and different places and in different contexts. And that's why you may see that, and you may hear that we hear about well-being in sport, or, you know, well-being in the family context, or well-being in life. All these different contexts really kind of blend and form kind of our overall picture of well-being in a lot of ways. So for me, I really see the importance of capturing well-being and the changes to well-being across different contexts and different times, and across different people and populations. What well-being might mean to coaches will mean differently, for example, to performance directors or to athletes as well. And it's important we don't forget that. It's important that we celebrate that. And it's important that we're kind of using lenses and perspectives of well-being that are understandable to the people we're looking to serve.
This is really fascinating, because listening to what you were saying, what you both were saying there, There feels a complexity to well-being. It might be individual specific, certainly context dependent. It can change over time. There's a temporal quality to it. There are two dimensions that feel like they encapsulate a lot of well-being historically, is what I'm hearing you say. Hedonia, how are you feeling? And eudonia, how are you doing? I think I pronounced that right. Eudonia, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you doing? Feels like those might encapsulate a lot of well-being, but without ignoring individual specificity, context, and time. And it feels like, because of that complexity, it feels like it might be difficult to capture well-being, measure it, and improve it. No question there, but that's kind of the job of you guys, is to try to capture it, to try to measure it, to try to, well, potentially to start suggesting ways to improve it. That feels like a very, very tough thing to do. It's an enormous challenge.
No, absolutely. And it's definitely something that we're encompassing. And for us, we're trying to kind of build an understanding of well-being. I would probably say we're both qualitative researchers. So we do use a lot of kind of interview techniques to understand people's experiences. And I think for me, there's two things that is really important when capturing well-being, and some are much easier to understand than others. So it's important to capture hindsight and understanding how people make sense of the well-being. So quite often we as researchers use quite retrospective methods. So quite often that's why we use interviews quite frequently, and really valuably capture people's understandings and histories and backgrounds and experiences, and the rich diversity of people's kind of well-being experiences. Now, what's also equally important, and it's probably just as difficult for a lot of researchers to capture, is the kind of in situ changes to well-being, or the in situ kind of present experiences of well-being, in which we look to kind of use, again, whether it's kind of live recorders and diaries, and ecological momentary assessments. So we're really trying to get the in the moment experiences of well-being. But that's quite difficult for a range of different reasons, because obviously, of course, beyond the fact that when people kind of know that they're being observed or watched and so on, their behaviors change and doesn't necessarily reflect their kind of naturalistic experiences of well-being. So that's where we kind of have difficulties with the methods and capturing changes to well-being, and also kind of the in-moment around events, around competitions, experiences of well-being. That said, I think there's a lot of kind of potential in the area in terms of capturing kind of not just individual well-being, but well-being in different contexts and different kind of cultures and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that's where I see that, and I'd like to hear your words, really, where we feel we could go with that.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think the issue with approaching well-being so theoretically these days is that, for example, if we approach it from like the general view, then you're using, for example, HR occupational practices, and we can talk about things like work-life balance, that has been proved to lead to well-being and essential to well-being. Well, then you speak to coaches, you realize work-life balance is just non-existent. But also they raise the question of, is it applicable? Like, should we even talk about work-life balance? Is it necessary to talk about it for our well-being? And, questions were raised in terms of, shouldn't we just call it life? One domain where, it's just a life, rather than this, and having the separation of the concept, and then having the pressure, I'm missing out on my family time because I'm here. I'm here now. Am I missing on work? And, through my work, we talked about this idea of being present, and rather talking about being present, making conscious choices in terms of where you are at the present moment, and that being actually somehow related to well-being. And, as Richard said, it might not be about understanding or defining what well-being is. I'm looking at it as how well-being works. For me, my research is about looking at the process of well-being and how it works, and I'm trying to capture the constant change and the dynamics, while Richard is talking about the changes as well through slightly different lens. But that's the beauty of it, because we're getting basically one concept from different angles with different methods, but we're getting there. And both we agree on is that one size fits all approach is just stupid and unrealistic.
And it's just only one extra thing I add on that, and we were talking about this earlier, but so it's why I like to see myself when we talk about, we use various different frameworks to understand different complex phenomena, and for me, rather than kind of address a framework per se, I see myself as a conceptual engineer, and I really see like the importance of adapting a theory, using a theory, but tweaking it over time. And we know, like, for example, we've had, obviously the past few years of COVID-19 and so on and so forth. We know that pre-COVID well-being looks a lot different to what it looks like post-COVID-19. And so for me, I really think it's important to use, we've talked about these different dimensions about, feeling well and doing well. It's important to use them as conceptual tools, and that changes and they overlap and they combine over time. And I think through us being more like conceptual engineers, researchers taking on the role of a conceptual engineer, there's a lot more potential when we're thinking about asking the question of what does well-being mean, or how can we define well-being, and so on and so forth, because we're more adaptable. We are more able to kind of, be encompass different views and change our thoughts and experiences based off what are our coaches saying, for example. And we've had the prime example that Marketa just mentioned as well about work-life balance, that we hear one thing in the literature, then coaches are telling us something different. That's because we are moving towards different frameworks that are evolving over time.
I love that term, conceptual engineer, and I'm definitely going to bring that into my own consultancy practice. I'm now going to go to the clubs, the teams I'm working with, and say, I am a conceptual engineer. And so as we tweak these concepts that we're working on, or these constructs that we're working within, then over time, we're engineering different solutions. Anyway, I love that. Thank you for that, Richard. And coming back to you, Marketa, something you said there reminded me of something Sergio Lara Bercial said to me on the Sports Psych show. He said that one of the coaches he was working with, he studied world-class coaching practices. So perhaps looking at coaching from through a slightly different lens here. But one of the coaches who said, look, I'm on the road a lot. I am away from home a lot. I am working 18-hour days at times. But I'm also at home a lot. And when I'm at home, I'm focused on my family. And I think it very much mirrored something that you said there, whereby different people will have different scripts, cognitive scripts, if you like, in their own mind, explaining their actions, their behaviors, their world lens, I suppose. And I think that's so important to bear in mind, isn't it? It's very easy for us, let's say in sports psychology, and I feel the volume of this has been turned up a little bit in recent years, to be insistent around well-being and mental health practices, but actually they can be quite complex and very individual specific. And I can imagine, as you were both speaking there, but as you were describing your research, Marketa, just thinking how some coaches would go, well, hang on a minute here. I work damned hard, but I love my work. And actually my well-being thrives and I flourish from my work. I feel great as a consequence of my work. It's not just you must have this amount of time off and you must do this and you must engage in this to have a happy life. It's not as simple as that, is it?
No, absolutely. And what resonates with me is when I think it's slightly related to the idea of social prescribing. Who are we to tell people what makes them happy and what they need to do to be happy? We should encourage individuals, coaches to be reflective, teach them techniques to self reflection, focus on that. But it is not our place to judge anyone when it comes to their happiness and the things they need. I wouldn't want to work 18 hours days and be far away from the family, but that's my choice, and that's why I'm not coach and I'm just academic working 13 hours a day, so but from a home office. So I just think, that there's a shift we need to make, and also when it comes to the contextual lens as well, when you look at different organizational statements at the moment, we talk about mental health, we talk about well-being, but how many of those statements actually, for example, talk about coaches' well-being? Despite research papers claiming how it's, they are performers in their own right and they have unique needs and unique challenges. Well, no one addresses the unique needs and unique challenges, and automatically just one size fits all again from the athletes. So
You've mentioned coach well-being there, and I think we can be guilty to condense the narrative more towards athlete well-being, and we can absolutely talk about that and address that today. But let's dwell a little bit on coaches' well-being. And I know we're talking about individual differences, and we're respecting context specificity. But I know in your work, Marketa, you've been exploring frameworks in order to help coaches manage their well-being. Can you speak to this a little bit? You've done some research around this, exploring coaches' well-being, a processual framework. Would I be pronouncing that correctly?
yes, basically based on on work with my supervisors and our research team, we found obviously the gap in the research, in the practice of, contextual dependency, yes, but no one focuses on coaches. So we knew we want to specifically focus on coaches. And then you read about well-being as something really dynamic, but then every framework so far, or majority of frameworks and most of literature, looks at well-being as state or something static. And so you think, well, we're talking about dynamic nature and then talk static. So basically, the type of research I did was about approaching coaches with the idea of me being inquisitive learner. So I went into the conversations, straight away admitted, I've coached for 2 years at the lowest level possible. You're a high performance Olympic coach. You teach me. You teach me what do you want to tell me about well-being. You tell me what it means to you, how it works, and I've fully shifted it to the coaches. It was very cooperative approach as well, because I always ask them not to, not only to feedback back about the interview and how they found it and if there is anything we didn't discuss, but I send them the framework as well, and I ask for their feedback, and I ask, does it make sense to you? Is it loads of academic words that are absolutely meaningless and you can't relate, or is it something where you feel like, okay, my experience fits that, this is what I was trying to say about it? So it's not just my work, it's the coaches and my research team work, because we've really worked on it closely together.
I love that you sat there, you said, tell me about well-being. Through your eyes, through your experience, tell me about well-being. And they told you about their perception of well-being in their environment with relevance to them. And you just wrote stuff down, and you went away. You returned with a bit of a framework, and you asked them whether that framework reflected what they said. Am I hearing you correctly?
More or less, yes. I went back. I reflected on everything myself, and I went back to them sometimes as well, and just
Gotcha.
like, you know what, this is interesting. We haven't discussed it properly, and that's my mistake. Let's have a conversation a bit more. And it was really, I always aim to have it as a good conversation, not a research environment, because you're asking a lot when it comes to talking about your well-being and your ill-being. It's very personal. It's not always a thing people would like to talk about, especially to a
Yep.
stranger, and especially to someone who would, use the quotes and would publish it. And so I always try to be very respectful and aim to make sure they are really comfortable with everything that is used and everything that I claim in my paper that is hopefully going to be published one day. I try to make sure that it's really true work with the coaches.
It's a co-creation. You did it from a consultative perspective, so I'm fascinated now. You've tapped some real interest here for me, because I think that's a very powerful position to come from a co-creation between researchers and coaches. What were the results here? What does that framework look like?
So interestingly enough, we moved completely away from that idea we discussed before, the hedonia and eudaimonic
Okay.
well-being. We completely moved away from it, and we discussed that well-being is actually about, you have these two sides where you have the coach's own identity that is like based on the personal values, that is, usually the things that initially got them into coaching, the things that keep them going even when times
Yep.
are tough. And on the other side, you have this culturally prescribed identity of a coach, the ideas of what they are supposed to be like. You can talk about, stoic demeanor and being the unshakable tough coach and all the other things around it. And we came up with this process and idea of integrated well-being and integration, where we say, you know what, well-being for coaches, it's not about either. It's about finding a way how to be yourself and bring the personal values and your original self and ideas of a coach into the culture. But at the same time, it's about the culture allowing for that integration, because we feel like, well-being of a person, it's not just the person's responsibility, it's responsibility of the culture as well, because you can educate coaches about well-being as much as possible and all the techniques and mindfulness they need to do. Well, if they work 18 hours a day, we can't blame them for not doing it. We need to change the culture, and the cultural shift needs to occur for the well-being to integrate. So it's basically the both, and it's constant process of kind of merging one into the other. And then we came up with, there are like behavioral section which are more of a practical things, how the process occurs. And we call it, they said the things that the behaviors that tickle me, but it ended up with saying what makes me happy. Then the practical actions that don't necessarily, make them happy and bring smile, but are necessary for functioning in that sport. And then contraproductive behaviors like extreme selflessness, for example, really common. And that's one thing we agreed with Richard. Very common when you talk to coaches about well-being, their well-being. First thing, they'll talk about their athletes. Always, always, always. Just athletes, athletes, athletes.
Thanks for breaking that down for us, Marketa. I mean, one of the things I heard lots of great things, but one of the things I heard central to this is that this isn't really an isolated scenario, is it? It's an individual's personal values. This is very value driven, so it's an individual's personal values times culturally imposed values that the individual, herself, themselves, they're not necessarily fully in charge of this well-being, or the things that influence their well-being, they may not be fully in charge of. There are culturally imposed values, perhaps beyond the control or beyond the coach themselves, that influence the well-being of the coach. That's kind of what I heard. I don't know if I'm going off in the wrong direction there, but what's your thoughts on that, Richard? Because I believe you're quite keen on this notion of, hey, we can look at the individual, but it's the interpersonal here. And when we're thinking interpersonal, we could be thinking team, we could be thinking environment, we could be thinking culture, I assume.
Mm. No, absolutely. And I think what's really key to recognize here is when we focus on individual well-being, how frequently does, like, let's say, like a factor that influences or can challenge well-being is personal relationships or work relationships.
Yep.
Now, that's for me, I think that's so my team at Leeds Becket University, myself, Dr. Faye Didymus and Dr. Tony Williams, that started to get us thinking that are we viewing kind of well-being on the right plane, on the right perspective? And for us, we really saw the potential. So we published a systematic review on organizational stress and well-being and what we'd in competitive sport, and what we'd identified there is that in a lot of ways that stress itself, and this is where my lens of well-being is focused on, stress in itself is a double-edged sword. So of course we know that the interpersonal side itself is a double-edged sword in terms that relationships can be both a stressor and also a coping option, and a coping option that's available to people like your coaches and athletes and so on. So this got us really thinking that we knew that well-being is really not as explored in the context of sport organizations and performance sports as kind of heavily as it can be in sport organizations. So for us, we thought, let's take another lens. Let's look at well-being among kind of dyads and triads. That's what we were really interested in. We were looking at coach-athlete relationships. We were looking at kind of the athlete-practitioner relationship. Then actually we started to think about, should we look at this as part of a triad? Looking at the coach-athlete, sport and exercise psychology practitioner triad. That's quite a mouthful if you say that again. So what that really interested me in starting to, think about well-being as a kind of social phenomena, and to really think about how well-being, so how we can, how well we are feeling and how well we are doing, how is that experienced amongst dyads and triads? And so our research, funded by ASP in the USA, started to really unpack and move towards an understanding, which we're working on at the moment, moving towards an understanding of psychological well-being in the coach athlete, we call it SEP, to save some words, triad. And for us, what really kind of struck us is that there was various antecedents, we call them, so factors that will kind of influence well-being, and then also a lot of kind of outcomes or outcomes of well-being in itself as well in the triad. So we started to look at kind of well-being, not just within an individual, but also within the key close relationships. And for us, we started to recognize the importance of psychological safety. I know quite often a buzzword used quite often, but actually psychological safety in close relationships and how integral that is to well-being within the triad. We started to unpack some other antecedents, such as organizational experiences leading to, work. I know we spoke about it today, work-life balance, and how relationships can help each other negotiate kind of a work-life, or I call it blend. I prefer the term blend rather than the balance per se. And it's through these kind of examples that we started to recognize the importance of understanding well-being at this level, to understand that what are the factors and what are the kind of positive outcomes of well-being being present within key close relationships. And then we started also to understand like how well-being was in a sense what we call transferred amongst the kind of relationships. And we started to really consider that processes such as what we call emotional contagion, how kind of the spreading of emotions from one person to another, how mechanisms such as interpersonal coping, where people are kind of collectively coping with stress together, and then also what we call social appraising. So the idea of how someone's perception of stress could influence their own perception of a stressor in itself. And those, in fact, could transfer our experiences of how of hedonic well-being, so how well we are feeling, and also how well we are doing as well over time. And so that's really kind of opened some doors in a lot of ways, that through understanding well-being within close sport relationships, we're moving from an individual level, which we've discussed before, can sometimes be criticized as being a bit of a deficit perspective. So it focuses well-being and ill-being are quite often muddled at the individual level. And quite often you're wondering, what are the actions and what are the takeaway points we can take away from this? When we're actually focusing on a factor that we know influences and challenges well-being, and taking this a step further and looking at kind of well-being, we're looking at relationships as a unit for kind of well-being experiences. We started to realize that there's a lot more of a potential. We started to realize how positive psychology can be really taken into action through using relationships as a vehicle to facilitate and protect psychological well-being. And so there's a huge amount of potential in this area to really focus on kind of psychological well-being and mental health within close sport relationships. A little bit of a caveat on which we're quite lucky in our research is that these are in itself quite close relationships, and we were very lucky in the way that when we were doing what we call triadic interviews, so we interviewed the whole triad, that these relationships were well established and quite close. And I think what would be kind of a challenge going forward is that we know that there's some inefficient and kind of some potentially, harmful and challenging relationships in a lot of ways. Now, that's one of the things that we found quite difficult, that we know that to understanding well-being within these close relationships is just as equally as important. But, doing it so on an interpersonal level is difficult, because if one person within the dyad or triad is experiencing the relationship quite badly, then they'd only really feel safe to kind of disclose that information in an individual interview, thus limiting our experiences to individual experiences of well-being. So there's a lot of difficulties and challenges, I think, for people to navigate in understanding an interpersonal sense of well-being. But there's also a lot of potential in kind of bringing kind of a newer way of understanding psychological well-being, which, to be quite honest, hasn't really been utilized as much in the social sciences as much as one thought it could be.
So, drawing on both of your research, if I'm a coach listening in and in condensing things in very simple tones, what I'm hearing is that I should get to know my personal values, because not all coaches, some coaches just go and coach and they don't necessarily consider those personal values, but by knowing them, they can be a protective mechanism when facing challenges. To potentially understand the culturally imposed values placed upon you. Who am I? Where am I situated in sport? What does this sport, what norms are in this sport? What norms are in this sport in my country or on my continent? So culturally imposed values, get to know those, because they're going to mediate how your own values play out on your well-being. By knowing your own personal values, you can take practical actions and identify counterproductive behaviors as well. So that's kind of drawing upon your research there, Marketa, as I said, very simple tones, and bringing in Richard, the fantastic work you're doing. We're also examining this more from an interpersonal perspective, specifically relationships, and how dyads and triads, when there's 2-3 of you, how do others impact on your personal values? How do they mediate culturally imposed values? How does the relationship mediate your well-being in general? And your relationships can help from a well-being perspective. They can hinder from a well-being perspective. And so drawing upon anything that helps create adaptive rather than maladaptive relationships is going to positively impact well-being. That's kind of what I'm drawing, again, in very simple terms, when you collapse and collide your research together. Am I anywhere near the mark there?
Yeah, I think you've summed it up really, really well. I just wanted to add that the relational aspect of psychological safety Richard talked about really resonated with me and my own research.
Okay.
Because what we found is that coaches discuss the importance of their organizations actually allowing them to be themselves, to put their personality through, and exactly by creating a psychologically safe environment. I know we're gonna probably get judged for using the term like in this, but from the relational perspective, where exactly there was this environment of trust and openness where they could, they could be themselves and they wouldn't lose on the relationships. And I think that's where our research really interlinks as well, because then Richard goes and obviously links it and looks at the relationships and the consequences of if the relationships fail, or on the contrary, if they are supportive, beneficial.
And absolutely, and I would just the last thing I would add as well, like it's opened up a lot of doors looking at through an interpersonal lens at well-being, because now actually some of my kind of ongoing research is starting to look at the leadership level of a sport organization. So we're starting to look at performance leadership and management for example your performance directors, and look at their experiences of well-being, but also how that their experiences of well-being influences how they could support well-being as well. And there's a huge relationship there in terms of how you manage yourself and how you then therefore have the resources to support and manage the direct reports that performance directors are supporting. So using the interpersonal lens of well-being on, for example, performance directors and coach relationships, for example, is something again that I think research is heading. Well, my research definitely is heading towards. But there's like this huge, ample potential at kind of understanding not just athlete and coach well-being, but also kind of the well-being of leadership. Because without like the well-being of leadership, how can we suppose to support the well-being of athletes and coaches when the people making those decisions aren't feeling well or doing well in the first place?
Yeah.
To your point there, Richard, and a question for both of you to potentially consider from a leadership perspective, do you think therefore that if we take this notion that the environment set by the organisation, and you both use the term psychological safety, which is personally a term I like. If there is not a lot of psychological safety running through, or perceived to be not a lot of psychological safety running through the organisation, do you think that a shared leadership model is therefore set by the coaches a better way to go than a sort of a traditional top-down leadership model?
I'm personally a fan of whether it's the shared leadership, servant leadership. I'm very big fans of those in terms of well-being. And of course, there's a lot of good research out there that looks at kind of leadership behaviors, looking for leaders at kind of different parts of an organization, which I think is vital. I think for me, it's important to recognize that leadership isn't always necessarily leading from the front. Sometimes leadership is that friend or that peer or that colleague next to you who's kind of quietly putting an encouraging word in your ear and supporting you along the way, and just kind of saying that little word that matters, or kind of like, in an academic sense, I know like we've spoken about this, but having the courage to, we talk about psychological safety, having the courage to speak up can be promoted by different types of people, not just the people leading from the front. It can be kind of like I mentioned, like it could be a teammate, it can be like a support staff, it can be a colleague who just kind of says the right words at a kind of meaningful time for someone. And I think, for me, like you going along the lines of kind of shared leadership and leadership behaviors and understanding that this is something that can be developed at all levels. I think, here to your thoughts, Marketa, but that's definitely where I can see it going.
I completely agree with you. And I feel like the culture itself will never probably be perfect. And I think there are a lot of things with like sport, for example, where there is a good side and bad side of it, and being competitive doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, but being extremely competitive, then it does. So again, I agree that it comes to having the people, not just the leadership, the top level, but anyone around you, encouraging you to self-reflect, for example, where the boundary is and what is still competitive, what is not.
I hear you both. I think it leads me to ask this question. Plenty of coaches listening in, respecting your research, drawing on your research, perhaps drawing on any practical experiences you've had. When we think about well-being, and you might reinforce some of this stuff you've told us already, what would be the main messages you'd want for those coaches listening in? What would be the main messages for them from a well-being standpoint? What's really important for them to practically do or to just digest, to consider in their coaching practice?
So for me, especially from my bringing in my angle of interpersonal well-being, I definitely see value in mentoring initiatives, in relationship building initiatives. So for me, I think it's vital, and this can sometimes be kind of, I say undervalued in some ways, because I think coaches are very good at forming their different networks and so on and so forth. But having kind of like a supervisory mentor who coaches can disclose to, I think is vital. And sometimes, as I know, sure, in your experience, Dan, sometimes coaches use the psychologist in that kind of perspective in some ways. Sometimes they just feel more comfortable enough to speak to kind of someone outside the sport. Sometimes they feel comfortable enough to speak to another coach and so on and so forth. I think having someone that they can kind of interpersonally, emotionally regulate with in a lot of ways, I think is really vital, kind of disclosing and understanding their well-being. I think it's also vital as well that they're building relationships. It goes without saying with a lot of things, but that they're kind of actively and proactively kind of working on developing their relationships with their athletes. And this is with a perspective of not necessarily enhancing performance, but on enhancing their well-being, and kind of taking through a step that I'm enhancing my relationship, not just for for enhancing a positive outcome in terms of performance, but into, I'm sure as other guests have said on your podcast, into looking at more meaningful ways of like the roles that sport plays in our lives. There's some coaches and athletes I've spoken to who, beyond some of the athletes retiring, those are meaningful relationships that they've established beyond sport, and they're still really kind of quite close friends. So I think it's also I would advise kind of thinking about how they can develop relationships, not for the purposes necessarily of sport, but for the holistic athlete, for example, for the all-round development of the athlete. I was at a football club at the weekends, and it was one thing I was actually hearing. It was good to hear a coach kind of discussing, was the idea of how we can promote kind of behaviors in people that transcend sport. And I think that's exactly that, in forming relationships and then modeling relationships that, people who in sport can then go and use and kind of transcend outside of sport, and, has an impact on them, on their kind of their whole longevity and the whole development across a lifespan. I think that's kind of almost a success in itself. So for me, to go back to the question, I see the importance in a lot of kind of relationship building and a lot of kind of mentoring processes, and again, having that kind of connection and interactions, positive interactions, is valuable.
So you're really seeing it from a interpersonal perspective.
Heavily, as I'm sure you can tell.
Yeah, I love it. Marketa, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I would say, from my perspective, coaches should try and really be reflective to their values, to what really matters to them. And one of the coaches I actually spoken to, and I found it absolutely brilliant, he created a value framework for himself and like assistant coaches. And he said, every time we have an important decision to make, and I'm a bit unsure, I just go back to it. I see it, it's written, and I make sure the decision I make actually reflects my values, because we all are guilty of it. When the pressure is on, when the time is on, you sometimes lose track of what really matters, and you just go with the easiest option, or with the option that's not going to raise too many complaints. But then you can reflect back and think, well, I actually should have done something else because I don't feel like that was good from me. It wasn't my choice. So, for example, creating frameworks seemed like a really good way. And now getting to know yourself as well. When we talked about, things like the coaches talked about relaxing and, the way to go. I get it. No, they don't have time. And quite often, when you hear things like mindfulness techniques, I think a lot of coaches are now fed up and don't want to even hear the word mindfulness. At the end of the day, their brain is running. And so, what I found is some just said, you know what, I couldn't do mindfulness. I started doing boxing instead because I constantly have to talk to someone, and that helps me switch off. And so, I would say, don't be afraid to move, to be flexible in your thinking. If someone says you need to relax, well, that doesn't mean, light up a candle and watch a film. That might mean take a 5-minute walk. If that's all you got, take a 5-minute walk, listen to really loud music if you have to, if your brain keeps going, whatever helps you. But again, that comes back to the point of get to know yourself, get to know. It's almost like, how do you call it in English? Trial and error. You need to figure it out for yourself, and that probably leads to being kind to yourself and allowing yourself to make a mistake, or waste a time doing things that you realize, oh goodness, that doesn't work. Well, don't be discouraged if it doesn't work. It just might doesn't work for you, and you might need something else in order to handle everything.
I love it, and I love the combination of your answers there. And as much as listening to you, Richard, no person is an island, and it's very difficult to retain a sense of well-being without exploring your relationships, what helps, what hinders, and then probably reaching out and striving to improve upon relationships or fix relationships or handle certain situations in relationships, for probably many reasons, but not least because by doing so, that can actually positively impact your own well-being within within your sporting world. And then yourself, Marketa, there, just thinking about, I was thinking of the words self-awareness. As you were talking, the importance of self-awareness, knowing your values, what are they, and striving to live and coach by those values gives it a real what, how, why feeling to it, as a kind of a critical appraisal. At the end of the day, what was I trying to do? How was I trying to do it? And why was I doing it in that way? And associating that with values and well-being. Well, what was I trying to do there? How was I trying to do it? Why was I doing it? Well, I was doing it because these are my values. I went to talk to that player because that's an important thing for me to do, and I did that, and that's made me feel better about doing that. So that what, how, why piece, and just as you were both speaking there, it was making me. I'd be keen to get your feedback here, and I assume your worlds collide a little bit with the work of Martin Seligman, and I was thinking about his PERMA model, positive emotion, experience, relationships, meaning, because meaning came up, and accomplishment as a forerunner. Those 5 things as a forerunner to well-being. Have you come across the PERMA model much before, either of you?
Yeah, I did. It's one of the, especially when you talk about identity and values, it's almost impossible to avoid it. I think from my perspective, yes. I agree into so much. I'm just trying to, how to say it? I am a big supporter of positive psychology. However,
yes.
I think as too much negativity, too much positivity can be damaging as well. And especially when you talk about high performance sport, I think it really puts too rosy glasses on sometimes. It detaches it from the reality. And then especially when I spoke to coaches, it almost talking on the relationship level, then it harms the relationship between me and the coaches when I come into this idea of overall happiness and this and that, and really everything is rosy and positive. I think it just kind of detaches from reality. And if you're using that, then that's great. But at the same time, I think in your work, then you need to focus on stress as well, and ill-being, and go on both sections and kind of cover both, rather than do either. If that makes sense, but that's just me.
It's a question that we kind of ponder as well. It's like when we break down well-being into a question, does it mean like, what is another way of phrasing it? Is it what is a good life?
Yeah.
Or what is a functioning life?
Yeah.
And that's a debate that we have quite often, and it's actually what's led to our collaboration. Is that whilst there's a lot that we agree on, that there's a lot of things that we want to kind of explore further in terms of like contentions in regards to what's the purpose of well-being. And when you explore back to the roots of Aristotle, and the good life and everything from that, and then you start to question about, like, when we think about it in this everyday and age, like what's a kind of understanding of well-being, and is it fit for purpose? And so that's kind of where you asked us the first question at the start, define well-being. I think for anyone operating in that space, they will look like they're dancing around it in some ways, but I think it's because there's so many different ways and perspectives of viewing what well-being is. I view it as like, what is a good life, whilst Marketa will see it more as like, oh, actually is that, and also what makes a kind of well-functioning life, for example. So I think it's important for coaches to understand that what does well-being mean to them. And that's a question I ask coaches and I ask participants, and they may try and look for a textbook answer, and that's not necessarily always needed. But we've talked a lot about values today, haven't we? Yeah. And I think in some ways well-being is very heavily embedded of who we are and like how we want to operate. And so, it's important, I think, for coaches to consider that in their own practices of how they understand well-being and how that influences who they are and how they operate their philosophies and coaching practices and so on and so forth.
And just to add to it, I think my, optimal functioning view and, moving away from the positive side, I'm speaking specifically about high performance sport and coaches. I'm focusing on the contextual level as well, because I think if we were to have a wider philosophical discussion about the term well-being, well then I'll probably go, I am happy to say philosophically it's the overall goodness and happiness, but that's not my work. That's in a way not helpful to anyone.
Lacks that practical advocacy.
It lacks the practical bit, and I think psychology is finally moving away from just being full-on theory. We're trying to get into the practice as well. And so I think big drive for this paper or this research we did with my team was to link it with practice and make it realistic and, have it as a foundation to other projects that will actually be in the field fully and practical and not just interviewing. So I think that's why I'm such a grumpy person when it comes to positive psychology all the time.
One thing that we do concur on, because whilst we can't necessarily get, we don't have the same conceptualization of well-being per se, but we agree on several things that when we think of dimensions of well-being, we agree that in terms of like the normative adequacy, in terms of like how it's understood by people and kind of, that generalizability is crucial. We also understand that contextual understanding of well-being is critical, and also that kind of sense of temporal dimension of well-being and how that evolves. And that is important, for example, for coaches to check in on their own kind of well-being and their understanding of well-being, especially after like a long season of, I'm sure we know in kind of football, for example, like how changing fixture schedules, kind of exiting competitions, going through kind of a vast amount of injuries in the squad. That's a lot for coaches to contend with. And, at the start of a season, their well-being will heavily mean something different to them, and their perspectives will mean a lot different to like further on in the season under different contexts and situations. So it's it's really interesting kind of considering that when we doing our work together, that's where whilst we diverge on some opinions, that there's where we converge, is that you need to get those dimensions correct. You need to get those dimensions understood when understanding our own personalization of well-being.
It's like you're each other's critical friend. You're checking and challenging each other all the time.
Yeah, well, no,
Very
absolutely.
much.
And we need more of that. I think we need to, in research sometimes, as people are afraid of kind of coming across someone who disagrees, but we both embrace that, I think, and that's why we like to think we work quite well together.
Absolutely, because you can't progress and change anything unless you challenge. And so I said it with my research, and I know we talked about it together, how, we're calling out the culture, we're calling out, in a way, the organizations and, the bad things they do to coaches' well-being. It's not ideal thing to present in papers because, everyone wants to get a positive feedback and, it's tricky, but at the same time, it's necessary. And so coaches can't deal with their well-being by themselves. They need support from the relationships, and they need culture that actually allows for it. And so initially, when you asked me about the practical recommendations for coaches, I was trying to phrase it because we actually, with my team, we agreed that, we need to stop constantly just educating coaches and teaching coaches this and that. Because, from my research, coaches know a lot. It being through athletes' well-being or their own self-reflections and studies, they know a lot. We need to start calling out the culture, the organizations, and do something about it there.
But and I would say that it still speaks to that line of research, the environment impinging on well-being and the culture impinging on well-being and relationships as well, still speaks to actions that individual coaches can take, because I do think sometimes coaches can be hard on themselves and they'll look to themselves perhaps internally first, and they'll say, well, I've got to fix this and I've got to be able to put up with that and I've got to be able to flex there. We talk a lot of, I'm just as guilty as anybody talking about psychological flexibility. But, to speak to both of your points there, I'm listening to both of you, and I can imagine certain coaches that I've worked with who probably at the time didn't feel like it was a cultural problem or didn't feel like it was a relationship or that they could lean on relationships. Whereas actually this line of research, both of your research, suggests that, look, that's important to go to this person and talk to them about this situation, or it's important maybe to go to the very top of the organization and say, hey, come on, we've got to shift this, because if I'm going to be the best that I can be in my position from a performance and well-being standpoint, then we need to put this process in place or go about this practice in a slightly different way. So I think almost the interpersonal side drives intrapersonal action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've spoken to some Scandinavian-based coaches as well as UK-based coaches and generally just international group. And for example, with the Scandinavian coaches, they all felt like they could actually go to their organization and call out some practices. And, if they made a mistake or had a bad season, they weren't straight away afraid they are gone. There was still the idea of, we'll try to keep you on board, things happen. However, with the UK coaching group, it was very much the mentality of, we see, for example, in football, where it's immediately one mistake, 3 bad games, coach is gone. And we have it in the research, we call it coach is a commodity, and the cultural mentality of, there's so many coaches actually capable of doing this role. Go, go, go. And then coaches are terrified of actually speaking up because who can blame them? They are easily replaceable like this. And then you need to think about how it actually reflects on their self-value. Because if your employee basically keeps telling you that, I can replace you anytime, any second after one mistake, well, then you're not going to think you're the most valuable person in the world, or treat yourself kindly, or allow yourself to say, okay, I need a break. So that's why I think the cultural bit is really, really important, because yes, coaches can do a lot themselves, and I think they even try, but it's a never-ending battle as well.
Fascinating. I could talk to you both about this all day, but respecting your time. Just briefly, what's next for you both? Where's this heading towards in the next few months for both of you?
Well, I'm in the final the final midst of my PhD, so I'm hopefully looking to submit. And I guess in terms of kind of the momentum, building the momentum and well-being, I really see, and it's a catchphrase that I was trying to search for throughout our discussion today, but I've only just thought of it now at the end of the interview. How great is that? I really see the importance of what I've identified in research as people have asked the question, what about us? But it's important about moving from what about us to this is about us. And that's where I really see my work in kind of understanding interpersonal well-being as integral to that. We want to see more ideas of like, this is about us rather than what about us, moving towards kind of from individual perspectives of well-being towards the idea of well-being within teams and well-being within close sport relationships and so on. And I think that for me is what I'm focused on once I'm completing my PhD, is continuing that line of inquiry, and I'm quite excited for that. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'm glad we've teamed up today to actually clarify a future direction of research there. Awesome. And Marketa, yourself?
So at the moment, I'm actually working on second study of my project, and we're looking at help seeking in high performance coaching. So shameless self-promotion. If any of the listening coaches would actually take part, I would absolutely love to hear that. And otherwise, the next step after it is we actually want to go to the organizations and start doing research there, and start doing education, and start checking, they know a bit, so what are you actually going to do and put in practice. So I think that's whereabouts I am at the moment.
Brilliant. And well, let's come to you first, Marketa, because you've given a shout out there to get some volunteers for your research project. How can you will have tapped the interest anyway of everybody listening in, but how can people follow you if you'd like to be followed on social media, and how can people get in touch and get hold of your papers and your work and ask any questions?
Of course. So they can follow me on Twitter. We talked about this with Richard. I'll admit I'm not the most active person on social media. However, I do respond to every single message I ever get. So I'm like a passive. But I am on Twitter. It's Marketa_Simova. Or they can just drop me an email. It's m.simova@shu@ac.uk. So anywhere there. And I would really love to hear from them.
Perfect. And yourself, Richard?
Yes, I'm always willing to hear from new and familiar faces. So I can be reached on Twitter as Rich Simpson _95. Don't know how I quite remember that. My email r.a.simpson@leedsbecket.ac.uk. And I also add as well, I'm available on LinkedIn. We're currently we're currently developing a wellbeing in sport and exercise interest group. So that's kind of my shameless plug as well, if people are interested in getting involved with that. Not just in terms of knowledge exchange, but in terms of, I've talked about relationship building and mentoring and kind of peer connections. I really see that as an area for people, for coaches, for academics, for practitioners, trainees to get together and just chat and just get to know one another and really embrace the pillars of well-being. So yeah, that's my shameless plug. I'm happy to get back to anyone who gets in touch and continue this conversation.
Fantastic. Well, that was a brilliant conversation. I can't thank you both enough. So thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you. It was fantastic and really good to self-reflect as well on our work. So thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.